Welcome to Get Rich, the podcast that helps you do just that. Get rich and stay rich. Hey, I'm Molly Benjamin. I'm the founder of Ladies Finance Club, one of Australia's largest financial education platforms for women. But before I started helping thousands of women take control with their money, I was a hot financial mess when it came to my own finances. And not the fun kind of hot, more like crying in a supermarket wondering where all my money went kind of hot. But here's the thing, if I can go from financial mess to owning a share portfolio, investing in property and building wealth, then you can too. My mission is simple, to make women rich. Because when we have financial freedom, we have choices, confidence, and control over our future. Every week on Get Rich, I sit down with some of the best experts in the industry to break down how we can all start investing, growing our money, and creating long-term financial security without the jargon, boring bits, or overwhelm. Because when women get rich, we don't just change our lives, we change the world. So if you're ready to start making some smart money moves, hit that subscribe button and let's get rich together. Welcome back to another episode of Get Rich, the podcast that helps you do just that. Get rich and stay rich. Now, today we're talking about the stuff no one puts in the rom-coms, the legal and money moves you need to know before you live together, get married, or you combine finances. So at Ladies Finance Club, we're all about helping women grow their assets, but we also want to make sure that we're protecting them as well. So I'm joined by Carolina Arico-Bennett, a family law specialist and senior associate in Lander & Rogers family and relationship law team, who's seen it all when it comes to relationships and money collide. So we're going to cover why the 2-year de facto rule is totally a myth in Australia, how binding financial agreements, also kind of the American term is prenups, how they really work and who actually needs one, a new pet law that could decide who keeps the dog in a breakup, the red flags your partner might be hiding assets, and what happens if you don't have a prenup at all. Now, if you've worked hard to build your wealth, or maybe you're about to get an inheritance, or you just don't want your pooch ending up in the wrong hands, then this one is for you. And if you're enjoying these episodes, please let us know by writing a quick little review or hitting that subscribe button. All right, this is definitely one that you might want to send to a girlfriend or pop in the WhatsApp group with your gals. Carolina, welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you on.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's lovely to be here today.
And you mentioned as well, this is one of your first podcasts, so we're excited to be the first.
It is. And I'm very excited that this is my first for Ladies Finance Club. It feels very fitting given the area that I work in.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned in the intro, this is all about what you should know before you say I do. But I want to know, what are the most common juicy legal mistakes people are making before they actually get married or move in together?
It's a really good question to start off this discussion, Molly. So, from the perspective of wanting to make sure that you're protecting your entitlements, if you're in a relationship and you were to separate, I'd say one of the key issues that's come up in my practice and colleagues have experienced as well is almost as basic as record keeping and being aware of your finances, being aware of what it is that you've got together and how those assets are held, as well as what liabilities you've got, because all too often we have people that are only after a separation realize, unfortunately, that perhaps there's a lot more debt than they realized, or assets weren't being applied, money wasn't being applied in the way that they thought it was. So just being aware, asking the questions, knowing how assets are held is one of the really big key factors.
And when you say assets held, what do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is any type of property, whether it's real property, so real estate, or we're talking about a share portfolio or even bank accounts, something as basic as, do you have a joint bank account or is in your sole name? It's really important to be aware of. And also how those assets are being applied. So where is income being paid to? How is it being used to pay bills? And something else that has come up, and whilst this isn't quite an asset, pet ownership is something that's been under the microscope with the new family law amendments, and something that people should be aware of, which is now something that is a legal factor, is in whose name is your pet registered. So if you do get a pet, it's something that is very new because it's only just come into place in terms of the Family Law Act and the recognition of pets. So when deciding after a separation who's going to hold the pet, basically who's going to own the pet and look after it, one of the things the court will look at is in whose name that pet is registered.
And I would assume a lot of the time that's just a job that gets left to the female. So
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, who's wormed it the most, they get to keep it.
Who's taken it to the vet? Exactly.
Yeah. So if we just break down de facto versus getting married, now, is it true when you're in a de facto? Well, let's break down first. What is a de facto relationship? Sometimes people like it's a certain amount of time, but that's not necessarily always the case.
Yeah, that's right. So often people will think that a de facto relationship is just you've been together 2 years.
Yeah.
And that's the commonly held misconception that we hear. In fact, a de facto relationship is just defined as a relationship between two people who aren't legally married and who are not related by family, and who, having regard to all of the circumstances, are in a relationship as a couple living together on a genuine domestic basis. So it's a very vague definition. And it doesn't really give people a lot of clarity. But what the court looks at typically in deciding if someone is in a de facto relationship are things like, have you intermingled your finances?
Yeah.
Do you have property together? Do you have a sexual relationship? Do you share a common residence, or do you live together? Do you share any sort of carer responsibilities for children, for example? The list is not closed, but those are the key things that we see. And that's why it's actually not necessary for people to be living together before they're in a de facto relationship.
Wow. And I was speaking because I had spoken to Tessa Kelman from Landon Rogers, and she had mentioned to me, we were talking about a friend who just got recently pregnant to a very new partner. And she was like, oh, they'll also be in an automatic de facto relationship. And I was like, I don't think she knows that. So I told her, I said, by the way, do you know this makes you in an automatic de facto relationship? She's like, what? So yeah, that was an interesting one. I didn't know either. If you have kids together.
Yes, absolutely. And look, it's not always the case. Just because you've got children doesn't automatically mean you have to be in a de facto relationship. But in most cases, it would. If you're together and you've had kids and it's not just a one night stand and you've sort of moved on with your life, then most likely, yes.
And could you be in a de facto relationship with maybe two people if someone was doing the dodgy?
Yes. So it is a little bit salacious at times and it can be quite shocking. But I've had situations where even very much older people who had someone in their 90s had multiple de facto relationships going on at the same time. So it is absolutely possible. Because the test doesn't say you must be living together full time, it actually leaves it open to the possibility that people you might be having an affair with, or situations where people have second families, mean that there are multiple de facto relationships at the same time.
Okay, wow. All right. So let's say I'm in a de facto relationship with my partner. I'm coming in with property, with assets. He's coming in with property and assets. Should we be talking about having a binding financial agreement, or as they call them in America, a prenup? Or is it if you're coming in with kind of equal amounts, you don't really need to? Like, is getting a prenup or a binding financial agreement like worth it?
The things that a prenup or a binding financial agreement, as we call them here in Australia, the things that they are aimed really to protect people from the costs and the stress of litigation in the event they separate. And it can be for the reasons of wanting to protect certain assets. So in that example you gave, if you've come into a relationship with certain assets, you'd like to protect that for yourself, or perhaps for your children if you've got children from a previous relationship as well. That is always a really good idea to get some advice about entering into a financial agreement so that you can, under the best protection that you can under the current law, sort of ring fence those assets so that they're not then divided if you do separate. Another situation might be you don't have to be a millionaire to enter into a prenup. You might just be wanting to protect a future inheritance. So if you don't have any assets, or if your partner doesn't have any assets, but one of you is going to receive something at some point in the future, that might be a good situation in which you might want to protect that, or even a family business or something of that nature.
Yes. And so in simplest terms, it's just a binding financial agreement. What is it? It's just like, if we break up, this is what's going to happen.
Pretty much. So, in simple terms, it's a contract between you and your partner or your future partner, depending on when you enter into it, because you don't have to be about to marry to enter into one of these documents, it is a benefit as well. You can do it at any time.
Yeah.
So, in entering into this contract, it's basically an agreement between the two of you to say, this is how we'd like our assets, our property, our liability, even superannuation to be dealt with in the event of a separation. So if we do break up, and obviously no one wants to think about those things when they're about to get married or they're in the early stages of their relationship. But if they do, this is how we're going to deal with that.
Okay. And if me and my partner are getting a binding financial agreement, can we use the same lawyer? Or does it have to be separate lawyers?
Separate lawyers. So you each need to get independent legal advice. There are many reasons for that. The main one is there are criteria under the Family Law Act, which makes it only binding if that criteria is met. So you need to get independent legal advice in order for that to be binding.
Because sometimes we hear people say, oh, but I heard once these people had a prenup and it wasn't worth the paper it was written on, or like they don't even work. What, in your experience, have you seen that happen? Or is that generally when they haven't been done by a family lawyer and they've just been done by any lawyer?
There are some situations that have gone through the courts where financial agreements have been set aside, but those are really extreme situations where there might have been something like duress. Mm-hmm. For example, if the agreement is signed 2 days before a wedding or the day of the wedding, we'll call it sort of, there's pressure. Exactly. So we call that the typical ink on the wedding dress type situation. If that's happening, then it's a pretty big risk there because you're looking at actually binding yourself to a contract. So the court does take it very seriously in terms of making sure that there's independent legal advice and that there are no other factors that would otherwise needs to be set aside. Another reason is fraud or non-disclosure. So if you enter into a financial agreement, but you actually know that you've got this $1 million share portfolio that you haven't disclosed, that's another reason why it might be set aside.
Okay, awesome. And for people who are thinking about getting one, and what I love about our Ladies Finance Club members and followers is they're building up their own wealth. So they are creating that asset pool that they want to protect, which is absolutely fair enough. What happens in a case where maybe their partner isn't doing as financially well and maybe can't afford a lawyer or to actually get legal advice?
So in those sorts of situations, if someone really does want to go ahead and have a financial agreement in place, then there's nothing wrong with that person paying for the legal fees for the other party, as long as they're not, forcing them to go see a specific lawyer and being involved in that legal process, and it's just limited to basically paying for the fees, and that's okay. You just need to make sure that there's no involvement or coercion in terms of the advice that's given and that it is purely independent.
So how much are we looking at for a binding financial agreement in Australia?
Yeah, so it really does depend on the complexity of the agreement itself. Because it is a contract, it needs to be drafted very carefully. So it depends on the size of the asset pool and what it is that we're looking at protecting. It can start from anywhere as a few $1,000s. So in my experience, it could start at about $5,000 and then obviously go into the tens of thousands if there's some significant complexity there or there's a lot of negotiation that needs to take place.
Yeah. But I guess that's a small investment if that means that you're getting a good outcome at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, and the other thing to think about is what you're trying to protect by entering into this document is litigation. And if you have protracted litigation in the family court system, that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, huge. Awesome. And okay, so that's kind of like binding financial agreements. If you're maybe going, oh, look, 5K, I don't think we've got that. Can we just do a back of a napkin? Like this is what we both are saying and both agreeing?
You can, but it won't be binding. So
that binding, like by the law.
Correct. Yeah. So the only way to actually oust the family court's jurisdiction, which means that they won't be able to determine your property settlement, is to do it by way of a properly drafted financial agreement. So what we normally recommend to people is get legal advice about your typical situation, because obviously every relationship and every situation is different. And then you can get an understanding as to whether you want to go down that path, whether you want to pay the fee for a binding financial agreement. And if so, then you're probably going to be protecting yourself in future if it's done right.
Awesome. And I'm assuming if you don't have one, if you don't have a binding financial agreement in place, it just goes through, not the court, but it just goes through like, okay, yeah, well, actually, what does happen if you don't have one in place?
Yeah. So if you don't have a binding financial agreement, and I mean, we saw this very publicly online with Jeff Bezos and his first wife, now that he's remarried and he has got a financial agreement in place for his new marriage. But for his first, what happens is if you can't reach an agreement, the court will decide.
Okay.
So there are legislative provisions that we've got as family lawyers to abide by, and what the court actually uses in addition to case law to make a decision about how a couple's finances are to be dealt with. So we look at distributing assets and how those assets will be altered between a couple. And we've got some principles for that. So the court will look to things like what contributions were made and what current and future circumstances need to be taken into account. So there are a whole range of factors that the court will look at in determining how that property is going to be altered or distributed.
I actually had a friend where they broke up when they brought up getting a binding financial agreement because it was just such a touchy topic and everyone comes in with different beliefs around money anyway. This killed that relationship, which is probably, you know, maybe that was, I don't know, a red flag. But how do you bring up the binding financial agreement conversation without, I guess, causing alarm or, and especially if you've already been together for a while and maybe you are getting that inheritance, I guess, how do you bring that up without the other party being like, whoa, what's going on here?
That is a really good question and not one that I have an answer to, although I can give some tips. I mean, there's just no easy way to raise entering into a financial agreement. In some situations, what I've seen, particularly with younger couples, is the family who's got the wealth or the trust fund or the potential inheritance or business will actually make it a condition in some situations of an inheritance that there be a financial agreement. Now, obviously, that's a wills and estates issue. And in terms of the actual practicalities of that, that would be something for an estates lawyer. But I have seen that being a way that people can raise a financial agreement without causing too much alarm or trying to avoid the relationship going belly up in such its early stages. And something else, I guess, or another way to raise it would be perhaps to say, well, this is us in the early stages of our relationship, having transparency and alignment on our future goals in terms of our finances.
Yeah.
It's a really good first step to sit down and say, let's be transparent, let's be open with each other. How do we see this relationship going in terms of our finances? And this is a way to help us do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you can say you just listen to this podcast and you think it's going to be really smart to have this conversation because you don't decide, someone else will. So you may as well decide. And this is a bit of a cheeky question, but I'm still very curious. If you're coming into a relationship with not as much as the partner, and obviously a huge part of our audience is women. So let's say a woman is coming into into a relationship without as many assets. Like if they're not bringing up the binding financial agreement conversation, like, do you just leave it?
Every situation is different, but in that general sort of situation, there's no real need for you to enter into a financial agreement if you're what we might call the vulnerable party. So you're not the one that's got the assets. Really, it's the other party that's more well off or that has the assets. They're the ones that are, I guess, if I could put it this way, at risk.
Yeah.
So if there is a separation, then they're the ones that are probably more likely to want to protect those assets. If it's not raised in that situation, I would probably leave it. But it doesn't hurt to ask someone for some advice.
And because you're dealing with breakups and divorces, separations every day, are there any patterns you see when people come to you or any things that they're saying or like any red flags that we can start looking out for? Like is like maybe the guy's acting kind of shady or shifty or assets are being moved without our knowledge or I don't know. Is there anything like any insights you can share there?
Absolutely. So what I see a lot, Molly, is unfortunately people coming to us after all of this has happened and saying, I noticed a couple of years ago he started moving assets into his family's name or friends' names, or all of a sudden all of the joint accounts were closed and I didn't have visibility over anything. A lot of the time, by the time you get to that point, you've lost a lot of that knowledge. So the most important thing I would say in terms of tips for people going through that is to have the conversation really early on, identify any odd patterns of behavior, significant cash withdrawals or income all of a sudden not being deposited into a joint account where it normally went.
Yeah.
Have the conversation. And if you can't find out anything or they're being really shady and trying to hide things, and that's often a really big red flag that something else may be going on.
Awesome. And we had a question from our audience just in regards to her new boyfriend is moving into her apartment and she's wanting to know, does she need to do anything to protect herself in that situation?
So by him just moving into the apartment, if she owns it, that doesn't automatically create any sort of legal right over that apartment. However, as we spoke about earlier, a de facto relationship, it can be automatic in the sense that you don't have to wait the 2 years to be in a de facto relationship. So if you are living together and boyfriend is contributing to bills and expenses for the home and making other contributions to the relationship, there may be a claim there down the line. So it's always a good idea. I mean, the best protection that someone can do is to enter into a financial agreement. And even if it just means in that financial agreement, all you're saying is, I'm actually just putting aside my apartment, but everything else that we accrue together is on the table.
Yeah.
So that's a really good way of dealing with this and raising this as an issue as well, where you're saying, well, actually, I don't mind what happens to our joint assets, but it's just what I've got at the moment, which I'd really like to protect.
Yeah. And that's a really nice and fair way of, I think, talking about that. And if they have an issue with that, well, that's probably a red flag in itself.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. And final question to wrap things up. If you're coming into a relationship and you're buying property together, do you both need to be on that title?
So you don't need to be on title in order to still have a claim for that property under the Family Law Act, provided that all of the other preconditions are met for your entitlement. However, given every situation is different, if you are making a contribution to a property, for example, you're contributing funds to purchase it, it's a really good idea to think very closely about whether you do want to be on title for that property. It may not be for everyone, but definitely get some advice about whether you should be on title, because sometimes in future, it just helps to give some peace of mind that the property is not going to be sold without you knowing, or anything, you're not going to be locked out of that home, for example, if you're in the midst of a dispute.
Awesome. And actually, that just triggered one question that came up on Instagram yesterday with one of our ladies. It was an anonymous post, but she had gone through a separation. She got the house, he got the money, but she wanted to she kind of regretted that decision. Once it's finalized, is there any way you can go back and be like, hey, actually, I want to change that? Or is it like once that's decided by the family court, it's done?
So once you've got final orders or a final decision, whether it's by way of a financial agreement or court orders that you've entered into by agreement, or even court orders that the court's made, then that's pretty much it. You don't get a second bite of the cherry. There are only very exceptional circumstances in which you can go back and try and renegotiate. And that is if there's been significant non-disclosure or there's a real reason for it. But ordinarily, you can't go back, unfortunately.
No. And we always say the best advice is to get advice from experts who do this every single day. So if people want to get in touch with you, well, anyone from the team at Lander and Rogers, or especially you, they love this conversation. They're like, oh, I think I need to maybe go into a binding financial agreement. Where can they go?
Absolutely. So, Molly, on our website, if you just search our names or search our team, Lander and Rogers, I'm in the Sydney team. I'm always happy to have a no obligations discussion with anyone who's looking at getting some advice, just to start that process off and think about whether it is in their best interests to pursue that further and get some more formal advice. But so is anyone in my team. So absolutely, if you go online, you can find our details out.
Awesome. And we'll pop the links in where you can get in touch with Caroline and the team Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and also awesome episode for your first ever podcast recording as well.
Thanks so much, Molly. I've loved being here today. Thank you so much.